The other interesting thing right now, Christy, is R360. Now, I know you and Britt have spoken a little bit about this in recent weeks, but I think last week's pod fell ahead of the joint statement from basically all the top 10 bar, I think, Wales and Fiji. Otherwise, the national unions getting together and saying, basically, look, if you sign with R360, you will not be considered for international rugby for test selection. Now, this was the firmest rebuttal, really the only rebuttal to date, because we spoke with
Alan
Gilpin, thank you, here in Sydney during the Lions series. We'd been in press conferences with Phil Waugh, basically saying, look, we're open-minded. We've had some discussions. We want to have some more. We basically were short on detail, which, let's face it, R360 has been. There's been a little bit more come out in the past week or so now, but this was a very firm look. If you sign with R360, you are not going to play Test rugby. Now, that's a big thing for Australian players right now, because clearly a home World Cup is on the horizon, and a lot of guys are desperate to feature in that. That's why Mark Nawaqanitawase is going to come back from rugby league, clearly. So what do you make, I guess, or what did you make of that statement? And how will that shift, do you think, the outlook for R360 in terms of this startup league's ability to sign players, get the players, the quality of player that they want to make this, the question is is this even a viable entity, really? There's been a lot of money thrown around. We've seen Payne Haas could make his spend his, $10 million or whatever and base himself out of United Arab, the UAE, all these hypotheticals out there. But this was a pretty firm, a line in the sand, if you like, saying, look, you play R360, you're not going to play Test rugby. How do you see it evolve from here?
Eddie Jones was just quoted in the Times overnight by saying he's not surprised that the unions kind of came out and said that, but he thinks it's totally short-sighted, because even though international rugby is thriving domestically, most parts of the world are struggling to pay, to remunerate, to keep your bottom lines down and to stay afloat. So he thought it was just naive to not look at it, but thought it was entirely predictable. And that's how I see it. Now, I think that in 6 to 12 months, it could have turned and flipped completely on its head. I think it is. I think Phil Ward did what maybe he thinks he has to do, but I can see him taking a different approach. Like, people were telling me beforehand that he was keeping his cards close to his chest, that he was coy, and you can understand why. This is a governing body that is basically saying that they think that they will be out of money come 2029 if they don't get their bottom line in order and if they don't lower costs. So why would you not entertain then offloading some of your $1 million players?
Which we had spoken about earlier in the year.
Totally. So I think that they've gone, well, maybe we have to hit the nail on the head. We can't have players leave. The other issue is Super Rugby. They've got a commitment to have the best players playing in Super Rugby. They've made commitments with the broadcasters to do that. And if they don't do that, then they could potentially jeopardise those contracts. And we already know, we've seen only 5 years ago, what it's like to, playing fun and games and chicken with a broadcaster. It doesn't always work out, does it? So I think from a broadcast point of view, from a Super Rugby perspective, they're doing everything they can. In my opinion, though, the genie's out of the bottle, and it went years ago. I think it's only a matter of time before something like this occurs post the World Cup in 27. That's why you're seeing RA try to contract people through to 28, is because they don't want absolutely everyone to go beyond the World Cup. And that's a real possibility. So how 360 plays out, yes, they are short on detail, horribly short at the moment, but this is the reason why they didn't try to get sanctioned about a month ago. They need to get their ducks in a row regarding insurance. Who insures the players when they're on international windows and so forth? What's it like from a medical point of view? Judicial systems, all these sorts of questions, they need to have dotted the I's and crossed the T's before they're going to try to get sanctioned. And even if they don't get sanctioned, I don't think they really care either. It will make it easier if it is. But I think there's so much more to play here before you can put a line through 360, before you can go, it's going to go the way of the 10s or the 12s and just knock it up.
This isn't the first time, and you mentioned the 10s and 12s, we really never got anywhere. But you think back to the turn of professionalism And the late Greg Growden covered it for the Herald at the time and rehashed it for ESPN in his time with us really well around the conclusion of the 1995 Rugby World Cup and South Africa, and basically how the Sanzar Alliance was formed on the back of this World Rugby Corporation talking to players, millions of dollars, basically making rugby professional before rugby became professional, and the good that came out of that. Now, if you're looking at, say, R360, as we said, horribly short on detail, it'd be a bold player to be the first one through the gate, wouldn't it? To come out and say, your first name, we're going Monday morning, it's, say, Zach Lomax, okay, from the Parramatta Eels and New South Wales origin, comes out as the first player through, and you're like, whoa, okay. How the dominoes might fall after that, who knows? But is there a situation, Christy, where a bit like how it happened with Live Golf, where the PGA Tour were no for months, and then we wake up, I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday morning, and it's Live and the PGA Tour have done a deal. Now, we now know that deal hasn't come about, but it was such a hardline stance from the PGA Tour there for so long, and then overnight, they realised, well, we can't just bury our heads in the sand. I'll throw this one at you. Is there a way that World Rugby and R360 come together over the next year or so and say, look, well, can we kick this down the road to 2028? Can we get through this World Cup cycle? Can we then look at a global calendar, which in itself was proved so challenging for rugby, basically since the start of professionalism and trying to align the two hemispheres? And your story for the Raw, I think it was last week, around potentially, the bit of momentum finally starting to move for the Rugby Championship moving to the start of the year. But can we make this a bit of an IPL style window somewhere in the year where, as you say, unions get club salaries off their books? It is a bit of a kind of a festival of rugby. Who knows whether that's going to resonate in Lisbon and Miami and London? Well, not so much London, but these obscure, rugby outposts, if you like. I guess the question, do you feel that these two parties will come back to the table in the next few months, maybe into next year?
I think they'll have to. And to be fair to people like Alan Gilpin, they've always just gone, we'll have conversations, we'll continue to negotiate. So it's the other unions. Like World Rugby doesn't dictate whether or not this Rebel League is going to get sanctioned. It's the World Rugby Council, which is made up of all the unions. So World Rugby, they facilitate, but they don't really have a seat at the table per se. It's an important distinction to make there. So I think they can. Unlike Live, where you support golfers or individuals, this is teams. I still don't know how this competition resonates to anyone personally, but
we might have Ripper Rugby.
Well, you could, but I don't think it's Saudi money either. They've been all along. It's never been Saudi money.
It's think. PE out of the States, right? That's what we understand.
Yeah, and some of there's been some talk around who it might be, but still could be a little bit of detail that's left to come out there as well. So it's not going to have this infinite pool of money like Live Golf will, and that's maybe one of the reasons why some people haven't taken it as seriously. The other thing is that they were trying to get this up through the middle of the Rugby Championship, and people were going, well, hang on a moment, we've got test matches here, you've said that it's going to be free. Well, clearly you haven't even looked at the international window. How can we take you seriously? Yeah. But the other issue here is, and from an Australian perspective, because we've got to always focus on the backyard here, is from a women's perspective. We might dig into this a little bit in a second, but they're struggling financially to pay the women. My understanding in recent days and recent weeks, or over the last week rather, that even though the women's comp for R360 was being looked up to get up in now 2027, that's now being brought forward to 2026 because investors didn't like that. They didn't like the idea that women would come second.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's come out there just yet, but that's very, very much back on the table, as it is trying to get Australian women's players, of which there are many, many quality ones, particularly in the backs. So
whose salaries could, in theory, be double, triple, quadruple.
In the same way that men's will, it'll be women. But the women at the moment, like with the exception of the Levi sisters and Charlotte Caslick, aren't getting remunerated that well.
And that's life-changing money for them.
Totally. So it makes it even more difficult for Rugby Australia to go, well, hang on, like we can't have one rule for the men and a different rule for the women. here in terms of we're going to allow Wallabies, we'll ban them, but we'll allow the Wallaroos. So it's potentially a way to help the bottom line on both sides of the fence here. So it's another thing that they'll have to consider going forward.
Incredible. It just feels like it's rolling on. Oh, what have you made, Christy, then of this is a slight sidebar, of the NRL's reaction and Peter V'landys? And there's starting to be a little bit of, I guess, criticism of PVL that, maybe you need to wake up a bit here. This isn't a cereal box competition. It may have the feel of that, but this is the power of rugby. And, I know you've got Pacific Championships and a World Cup coming next year, but let's face it, International Rugby League doesn't shift the dial. Certainly for the Polynesian players, it's great to see guys going back and representing Samoa and Tonga, but there's no money in that. Like, that is purely a love of the game, love of family, love of heritage play for them. This feels, if they got a Payne Haas over the line, would be incredible. And that would be a real, not just a wake-up call, that would be a dagger blow to the NRL right now. And as I say, if there's one domino that falls in the NRL, I reckon there's a heap that go.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And the other thing to consider that is, if a Payne Haas or a Ryan Papenhuyzen go, well, are the Wallabies not going to seriously entertain a Ryan Papenhuyzen potentially playing for the Wallabies, who might get 20 games under his belt before a World Cup, and then you maybe consider bringing him in the squad? You'd be mad not to. So he's not the only one. There's several of them. And that's why I think that whatever is said now won't necessarily be what happens in 9 months' time when they do try to get it sanctioned and completely up and running. So it is a moving feast. There's a lot of people that are still skeptical. There's agents that are still skeptical as to whether or not it will get up. But they're now all at the start gate because they don't want to get left behind.
Yeah.
And nor do the players either. So clearly, papers like News Corp are dedicating a lot of time and space to it. I think you'd be naive to be, as Peter V'landys has done, as to try to belittle the competition. There's a lot of money here, and you can.
And there's an interest, Christy. I know from our website traffic that an R360 explainer is light years ahead of any other story we've done this year, and I mean light years.